Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. This podcast introduces the idea of performativity. Performativity is here discussed in relation to the practices of the modern research university, which it is deforming into new, ever more dysfunctional forms. The history of the modern research university is worth taking a look at. The modern university incorporated both the idea of a liberal education and the subdivision of knowledge into disciplines. This was, as you might imagine, an uneasy arrangement, given that the former was designed to combat the latter. For more on liberal education, see the accompanying podcast. What I would like to discuss here is how the system that governed the modern university was increasingly replaced. If the modern research university was characterized by the diligent single-mindedness of subject specialists on the one hand, and the calm repose of the liberal scholar on the other, the performative university is characterized by the hyperactivity of today's academic who has lost the focus of a single discipline and who works in an institution that can no longer justify itself by the idea that it is forming a moral, intellectual elite. Anticipated to some extent by the French philosopher Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition, first published in 1979, this new performative arrangement has risen to prominence as older discourses have fallen from favour. It follows a gradual loss of faith in the high ideals of enlightenment and a loss of faith in the promise of the modern research university. It follows a loss of conviction, whose endpoint Lyotard famously characterized as incredulity towards meta-narratives. This growing incredulity or disbelief generates a crisis for educational institutions, since they are no longer so readily legitimated according to universal categories, such as universal reason or morality, or the pursuit of independent truth. Instead, they are legitimated according to more immediate and lowly objectives, such as their operating efficiency, rather than their ability to realize transcendental, higher goals. An accompanying podcast on instrumental reason discusses this reduction of education to more immediate objectives. In many respects, performativity as a term describes the kind of institutional and social arrangements that instrumental rationality leads to. The performance efficiency or performativity of educational establishments has increasingly become their primary objective. Great emphasis is now placed on their ability to meet desired outputs, rather than their capacity to inquire into the nature of and question the desirability of those outputs themselves. Hence, the question now asked of higher education and the knowledge it produces is not, is it true, but what use is it, which generally means, is it saleable, and is it efficient? As Lyotard recognized, the general effect of all this has been to subordinate the institutions of higher learning to the existing powers. The loss of an independent, legitimating rationale has led to a situation where the university is more and more vulnerable to objectives that are not of its own making. Previously, Lyotard argues, the task faced by academics entailed the formation and dissemination of a general model of life, legitimated by a moralistic and sometimes emancipatory narrative. In a context of delegitimation, however, where there is a loss of faith in modern ideals, universities, Lyotard writes, are called upon to create skills and no longer ideals. So many doctors, so many teachers in a given discipline, so many engineers, so many administrators, etc. There is a return, in other words, to vocational categories. However, these vocational categories are no longer crowned by theology and the formation of a priesthood as they were in the medieval university. These professions themselves, though they might have a noble heritage, are coming under the sway of performativity. Doctors might still mention their code of honour, the ethical principles that they work by, but in their daily practice, more immediate instrumental demands, such as cost-effectiveness, have come to dominate. Returning to education, we might observe that a consequence of all this focus on equipping us with skills rather than moral or intellectual dispositions is that there is nothing left that distinguishes the university from potential competitors. Indeed, if other institutions can be shown to fulfill these tasks more efficiently, the university can be expected to give them up. A recent example of this contraction of role is that schools rather than universities in England are now expected to take responsibility for the training of teachers. Formerly, this might have been resisted by some kind of argument to the effect that universities offer something higher, some kind of access to greater learning and expertise that schools on their own are unable to offer. Where once it could be argued that universities offered an independent point of view from which to approach the profession of school teaching, a view from the outside that would be invaluable when developing a critical view of the teacher's professional practice, today the intellectual and moral independence of higher educational institutions is no longer valued or trusted. Hence the knowledge universities now promise to transmit, deemed necessary for the training of future workers and professionals, is, as Lyotard argues, no longer designed to train an elite capable of guiding the nation towards its emancipation or towards its moral betterment, but to supply the system with players capable of acceptably fulfilling their roles at the pragmatic posts required by its institutions. The university defends itself today by showing that it can and will do what has been asked of it. In order to adapt to circumstances that are not of its making, it is felt necessary to break down barriers within the university itself. The old 19th century model of the university, where each disciplinary subfield has its own place within the system, its own methods, and its own recognized experts, is now seen as outmoded. Traditional academics of this kind are dismissed for remaining within their disciplinary silos, as they are called, for working in splendid but useless isolation. Against this work habit from which they are presumed to suffer, academics are invited, rather insistently at times, to become interdisciplinary, to adopt an approach to knowledge production that, for Lyotard, is specific to this age of delegitimation and its hurried empiricism. In effect, it is believed that once interdisciplinary research sheds the old boundaries of disciplinary inquiry, it will better relate to a complex reality, which is to say, it will be more amenable. The problem with isolated academic disciplines from a performative point of view is that each discipline adopts a specific point of view based on a historical tradition, and hence is not always so easily adapted to shifting needs. By forcing academics to communicate across traditions and across worldviews, these old disciplinary barriers to becoming operationally efficient and responsive are weakened. In a performative culture, the critical and preordained gaze of a disciplinary worldview is regarded as an increasingly useless affectation. It is perhaps remarkable that academics still work within older discourses, of criticality, for example, however superficially they may be enacted. It seems that as one educational age follows another, select educational notions from preceding ages are retained, though not without adjustment. Hence the ideal of a liberal education lives on in the university, just like the ideal of a progressive education lives on in the context of schooling. Indeed, once it becomes an impossible ideal, impossible to realize in an age of performativity, the notion of a liberal education is held on to rather desperately. For this reason, it is important that we examine how these older educational philosophies are kept in play and explore how they operate in new contexts. It is worth remembering that in the history of education, each historical transition point is not absolute. To take an immediate example, Lyotard claims at the end of his account of education, of its delegitimation and then re-legitimation through performativity, that this new performative age sounds the knell of the age of the professor. But the end of something is often only its transformation into something else. In this case, the figure of the professor is not about to go extinct. To the critical gaze, it might seem that the professor has been transformed from a person with recognized expertise, who can profess on a specific topic like few others, to a person who is expert in institutional conformity, who knows how to work the system and advises others how to do so too. Though many professors still present themselves as defenders of a liberal education, though they may not use the term, or more occasionally as proponents of a more dissident politics, most will not have succeeded in their posts on that account. Many will have reached the top of their profession because they have learned to give the system what it needs. The situation facing today's university is serious. Today's university workers are expected to devote themselves to the enhancement of their own institutions through the pursuit of performative criteria such as institutional innovation, excellence, rankings, student satisfaction, student retention, international esteem, research funding, and so on. Most academics today no longer give consideration to a new research idea without first asking if the proposed research is fundable and if it will result in publications that will enhance personal prospects and institutional prestige. Work that is likely to be at odds with the fashions of the day, that may not as a result secure funding, and could well lead to writing that will struggle to gain acceptance by one's peers in the most prestigious journals, may not for those reasons be pursued. Or such research will be adapted to make it palatable and thereby fundable and liable to be published. The overall effect is insidious. The basic research question, is it true, has been almost entirely replaced by its impoverished cousin, what use is it? As academics find themselves constrained by the insistent demand to respond to matters of need, they are governed by a performative culture that is obsessed with capitalizing on everything they produce. As a result, academics risk losing a point of view that is perhaps not one of free thought, but is at the very least able to take a position which allows those working in a university to reflect on and perhaps contest how we are compelled to act and think in certain ways. These ideas are discussed in more detail in Chapter 12 of Education and Philosophy. If you would like to hear another podcast discussing a key idea related to education and philosophy, click below. Thank you for listening.